The air inside the small wooden chapel was still, thick with the scent of aged pine and beeswax, a stark contrast to the biting October wind he had just escaped. 11-year-old Levi James Thornton gently laid his 3-year-old sister, Hope, down upon a thick woolen blanket he had found stacked neatly in the corner. Her small body, limp with fever, was a fragile weight he had carried for 8 agonizing hours. After he managed to spark a flame in the small cast-iron stove, the first wave of warmth began to push back against the room's deep chill. It was only then, seeing the soft firelight flicker across his sister's pale face, that the dam of his resolve finally broke. He fell to his knees on the rough-hewn floorboards before the simple altar, and a sound he had suppressed all night tore from his throat. He wept, not from pain or fear, but from a profound and overwhelming gratitude that was so immense it felt like it would shatter his very bones. This single moment, a boy's quiet collapse in a forgotten sanctuary, is the heart of our story. If you feel the weight of his journey already, let us know in the comments where you're listening from in the world. Your support helps these stories find the people who need to hear them, so please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. I promise you the path that led to these tears is a testament to the hidden strength of the human spirit, and it is a journey worth following until the very end. The reason for this overwhelming relief, found in a place that shouldn't exist, is a story of hope found in the deepest despair. But to understand the depth of that gratitude, to truly comprehend why the sight of a simple blanket and a pile of firewood could shatter an 11-year-old's composure, we must travel back in time. We must return to the previous evening, to the cold and rainy night of October 15th, 1883. We must go back to the precise moment when the last vestiges of a home were stripped away, and 2 children were cast out into the unforgiving darkness of the Appalachian wilderness, left to the mercy of a world that had seemingly forgotten them. Their story does not begin with salvation, but with betrayal. Levi James Thornton was 11 years old, but he carried the weight of a much older man upon his narrow shoulders. For the 10 months that had passed since his father's final, rattling breath had filled their small homestead, Levi had learned that grief was not a single event, but a constant presence, a cold draft that seeped through the floorboards and settled deep in his bones. The house itself seemed to mourn. The warm, familiar scent of pine shavings and wood smoke from his father's workshop had been replaced by the stale, thin odor of neglect and the sharp, unwelcome perfume of his stepmother, Delilah. The easy laughter that once echoed off the walls had been absorbed by a heavy, oppressive silence, a quiet so profound that Levi could sometimes hear the frantic beating of his own heart, a lonely drum in a forgotten corner of the world. He was a boy living in the ghost of a home, a place defined not by what it was, but by everything it had lost. His primary purpose, the single star he navigated by in this new darkness, was his 3-year-old sister, Hope. She was the last piece of their mother, Sarah, left on this earth, a fragile legacy of light and warmth. Levi had become her entire world. He was the one who braided her fine, corn-silk hair, who sang the quiet lullabies their mother used to sing, and who held her small hand in his, a silent promise that as long as he was there, she would not be alone. He fed her, protected her, and absorbed the chilling glares from their stepmother so they would not fall upon her. This was not a choice he had made, but a duty that had settled upon him as naturally as breathing. He was Hope's guardian, her brother, and in the hollowed-out spaces of the Thornton homestead, he was her only parent. The source of the home's pervasive chill was Delilah Crane, a woman who had worn a mask of gentle affection until the ink on my father's will was dry. Now, her true nature was the climate in which they lived. Her cruelty was not always in her actions, but in her deliberate inaction, in the withholding of a kind word or a warm meal. She moved through the rooms like a spectre of resentment, her eyes sweeping over the children as if they were inconvenient furniture left behind by a previous tenant. Her voice, when she chose to use it, was as sharp and cold as the October wind, cutting away at Levi's spirit piece by piece. They were a constant, living reminder of the man she had married for security, and it was a reminder she had grown to despise with a quiet, simmering intensity that was far more frightening than any shouted rage. Their days were measured by a routine of thinly veiled hostility. Meals were a stark illustration of their new reality. While Delilah ate roasted chicken at the head of the table, Levi and Hope would be given a small bowl of watery potato soup and a single slice of stale bread. Every evening, Levi would perform a small, sacred ritual of defiance. He would break his bread in two, and under the cover of the table press the larger half into Hope's small, waiting hand. It was a silent act of rebellion, a declaration that Delilah could control their food, their home, and their freedom, but she could not touch the bond between them. This small, secret act of sharing was the most potent form of love he had left to give, a sacrament of survival in a house devoid of grace. Yet even in the suffocating gloom, small pockets of light persisted. These moments were rare and always stolen, taking place in the dead of night when Delilah's soft snores from the master bedroom signaled a temporary truce. In the cramped attic space they shared, Levi would whisper stories to Hope, tales his father had told him of clever foxes and brave pioneers who carved a life from the unforgiving wilderness. He would use a small, smooth wooden bird, the last thing his father had ever carved for him, to act out the parts, its silent flight across the patchwork quilt a fleeting vision of freedom. In those hushed hours, with the moonlight filtering through a crack in the roof, he could almost believe they were safe, that the warmth of his stories could hold the coldness of their world at bay until morning. The memory of his father, Daniel Thornton, was both a comfort and a source of profound pain. Levi would close his eyes and conjure the image of him, a tall, strong man with sawdust in his hair and a smile that could make the sun feel warmer. He remembered the feeling of safety in his father's workshop, the rhythmic scrape of a handplane against wood, the low hum of his father's voice as he worked. That workshop, now sold and emptied by Delilah, had been the heart of their home, and its silence was the most painful void of all. Daniel Thornton had been a man who built things, who created warmth and stability with his own two hands. Levi clung to these memories as a starving man clings to his last crust of bread, a reminder that a better world had once existed. The first shadow of the coming storm appeared in the form of a visitor, a wealthy merchant from the nearby town named Mr. Abernathy. He was a portly man with a gold watch chain and an air of self-importance. When he came to call, a strange and unsettling transformation would come over Delilah. She would produce a strange, sugary smile that never reached her cold eyes and speak in a voice that was artificially sweet. Levi, watching from the shadows of the hallway, felt a primal sense of dread. He didn't understand the precise nature of the threat, but he knew with a child's unerring instinct that this man's presence was a catalyst, an agent of change that would not bring anything good for him or his sister. He was the harbinger of an ending. The constant state of vigilance was wearing Levi down, body and soul. He was a boy tasked with a man's burdens, and the strain was beginning to show. His hands, once soft, were now rough and calloused from splitting firewood and hauling water. There was a permanent ache in his back and a tension in his shoulders that never seemed to leave, even in sleep. But the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the mental toll. He was always listening, always watching. Every creak of a floorboard, every sharp intake of Delilah's breath sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was a soldier on a battlefield where the enemy lived under the same roof, and he knew that a single misstep could have devastating consequences. Hope, in her innocent way, was a living barometer of the house's emotional weather. She was too young to comprehend the complexities of their situation, but she felt the absence of love like a physical cold. She clung to Levi constantly, her small arms wrapped around his leg, her face buried in his side whenever Delilah entered a room. Sometimes, in a quiet moment, she would ask a question that felt like a knife in Levi's heart. "Where did Papa go?" she would whisper, her voice small and uncertain. And Levi would have to find an answer, a simple, gentle lie that would shield her from the brutal truth of their abandonment, a truth he was forced to carry for them both. In the final days before the 15th of October, the atmosphere inside the homestead grew thick and suffocating, charged with an unspoken ultimatum. Delilah's visits with Mr. Abernathy became more frequent, and her impatience with the children curdled into a palpable animosity. She ceased speaking to them altogether, communicating only through harsh gestures and icy glares. Her silence was a weapon, far more menacing than her sharpest words had ever been. It was the quiet before a lightning strike, the eerie stillness of the air before a tornado. Levi felt it in the pit of his stomach, a cold, hard knot of fear. He knew with a certainty that defied logic that something was about to break. On the evening of the 15th, a cold, persistent rain began to fall, drumming a somber rhythm against the roof and windows. The sound was a mournful accompaniment to the dread that had taken root in Levi's chest. After their meager supper, eaten in complete silence, he took Hope upstairs to their small attic room. He tucked her into her cot, pulling the thin, worn blanket up to her chin and whispering a prayer his mother had taught him. As he looked at her sleeping face, so peaceful and unaware, a wave of desperate, protective love washed over him. He felt an overwhelming premonition that this was the last night of the life they knew. He didn't know what was coming, but as the rain lashed against the glass, he sensed that the fragile shelter he had struggled to maintain was about to be washed away forever. The true nature of the threat did not arrive like a thunderclap, but like the slow, insidious creep of freezing water. It began with the sound of the front door opening and closing long after darkness had fallen, a rare and unsettling event in their isolated homestead. Levi, lying awake in the attic, heard the low murmur of voices from the parlor below, the smooth, confident tones of Mr. Abernathy, and the clipped, serious responses of Delilah. The rain pattered against the roof, a nervous, incessant tapping that mirrored the frantic beating of his own heart. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that this late-night visit was not a social call. It was a negotiation, and he and his sister were the currency being traded. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a verdict that would irrevocably alter the course of their lives. Driven by a desperate need to understand, Levi slipped from his cot and crept to the top of the narrow attic stairs, his bare feet silent on the cold wood. He pressed his ear to the floorboards, straining to decipher the muffled words that drifted up through the cracks. Most of it was lost to the drumming of the rain, but certain phrases cut through the noise like shards of glass. He heard Mr. Abernathy say the word unencumbered, a term he didn't fully understand but felt the sting of nonetheless. Then, a moment later, another phrase, clearer this time, a final obstacle. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp, and Levi felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty attic. He was beginning to understand that their very existence was a problem to be solved, a knot to be cut, a final piece of unwanted baggage to be discarded before a new journey could begin. It was Delilah's response that sealed their fate. Her voice, when it came, was stripped of all its usual pretense. It was not the sharp, irritated tone she used with them, nor the syrupy false sweetness she reserved for visitors. This was a voice he had never heard before, as flat and emotionless as a winter sky. "It will be dealt with," she stated, her words carrying the weight of an unbreakable vow. "By morning the matter will be concluded. The house will be ours alone." That phrase, "ours alone," struck Levi with the force of a physical blow. It was a declaration of ownership that explicitly excluded him and his sister. In that single, chilling sentence, he understood everything. They were not just an obstacle. They were an infestation to be cleansed, and the cleansing was imminent. He scrambled back from the stairs, his breath catching in his throat, a silent scream building behind his teeth. He looked over at Hope's small form, a gentle rise and fall of the blanket in the darkness, and a wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over him. She was sleeping the peaceful, untroubled sleep of a child who believes she is safe, a child who trusts that the world is governed by a fundamental sense of fairness. How could he explain to her that the woman under their roof, the only maternal figure she had ever known, was methodically planning their erasure? The walls of the attic, once a refuge, now felt like the closing sides of a trap. He was a boy, armed with nothing but a fierce love for his sister, standing against a tide of calculated cruelty that he had no power to stop. An hour later, the sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, followed by the heavy, deliberate tread of Delilah's footsteps on the main staircase. But they didn't turn toward her bedroom. They continued upward, each step a slow, methodical drumbeat marking the final moments of their life in that house. Levi froze, his body rigid with dread. He knew those steps were meant for them. This wasn't a punishment for a misdeed. This was an execution of a plan. The silence that followed as she reached the top of the stairs was more terrifying than any sound, a predatory stillness that preceded the final decisive strike. He held his breath, listening to the frantic pounding in his ears, a lonely drum in a house that was no longer a home. The attic door swung open with a low groan, casting a long, distorted rectangle of lamplight onto the floor. Delilah stood silhouetted in the doorway, a figure carved from shadow and cold resolve. Her face, illuminated from below, was a pale, emotionless mask. Her eyes, usually filled with a simmering resentment, were now unnervingly calm, like two chips of dark ice. She didn't speak immediately, simply stood there, allowing the cold draft from the hallway to snake into their small room, a tangible emissary of the unforgiving night that awaited them. In her stillness, Levi saw the absolute finality of her decision. There was no anger left, no frustration, only the quiet, efficient purpose of a person tidying up a loose end. "Get up, Levi." Her voice was a low whisper, yet it carried across the small room with the force of a command. There was no room for negotiation in her tone, no possibility of appeal. As he slowly rose to his feet, she laid out the terms of their new reality with a brutal, dispassionate clarity. Mr. Abernathy had formally proposed marriage. He was a man of means and standing, and he would provide her with the life she felt she deserved. His one condition, she explained, was that he would not start this new life burdened by another man's children. The words were delivered without a flicker of remorse, as if she were simply reading an inventory list. They were items to be cleared out before a new tenant could move in. He tried to speak, to form a plea, but the words died in his throat. He saw in her eyes that it was useless. She looked at him not as a stepson, not even as a child, but as an object. "You were your father's responsibility, not mine," she continued, her voice as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of broken glass. "His death was an inconvenience I have tolerated long enough." This was the unvarnished truth of her heart, a cruelty so profound it was almost surreal. She was not just abandoning them, she was erasing them from her history, scrubbing clean the slate of her life so a new, more profitable story could be written upon it. He was witnessing the complete and utter absence of human compassion. Without another word, she moved past him to Hope's cot. With a rough, impatient movement, she tore the thin blanket away and lifted the sleeping child. Hope let out a small, confused whimper, her body limp with sleep. Delilah didn't soothe her, or even adjust her grip. She held her sister as one might hold a bundle of laundry, her touch devoid of any warmth or care. She turned and thrust the small, warm body into Levi's arms. The sudden weight of his sister, her small head resting against his shoulder, her breath a soft puff against his neck, was a shock that jolted him from his paralysis. This was real. This was happening. He was now the only thing standing between his sister and the abyss. Her hand clamped onto his upper arm, her fingers digging into his flesh like talons. She pulled him from the attic, her strength surprising and absolute. He stumbled behind her, his bare feet slapping against the cold floorboards, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief and terror. Down the stairs they went, past the ghost of his father's workshop, past the parlor where their fate had been sealed, and toward the back door that led to the churning, rain-swept darkness. He clutched Hope tighter, trying to shield her small body with his own, a futile gesture against the storm that was about to consume them. Every step was a step away from the known world, a step toward an unimaginable and terrifying future. At the door, she finally released his arm and slid the heavy iron bolt. For a moment she paused, her hand on the latch, and looked at him. The flickering lamplight caught the cold, dead light in her eyes. She raised a hand and pointed not at a road or a path, but at the impenetrable blackness of the forest. "Walk," she commanded, the single word a final, brutal severing. "Your father was always talking about Providence. Let's see if it's listening. I am done with the both of you." Her voice was a flat, emotionless monotone, the sound of a chapter being closed, a book being slammed shut. There was no flicker of doubt, no hint of regret, only the cold, hard certainty of her decision. Then the door was open, and a violent gust of wind and rain tore into the house, extinguishing the lamp and plunging them into near-total darkness. A firm shove from behind sent him staggering out into the cold, slick mud. He barely kept his footing, his arms wrapped desperately around his sister. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them, the sound swallowed by the roar of the storm. It was followed by a sound that would haunt Levi's dreams for the rest of his life. The solid metallic thud of the bolt sliding into place. It was the sound of being locked out, the sound of being forgotten, the sound of their world ending. They were alone, barefoot and clad only in their nightclothes, left to the mercy of the vast, indifferent Appalachian wilderness. For a long, silent moment after the bolt slammed home, Levi did not move. He stood in the cold, slick mud, the rain plastering his thin nightshirt to his skin, his mind refusing to process the absolute finality of the sound. It was not just the noise of metal striking metal. It was the sound of a world ending, of a door being locked on his entire existence. The darkness of the Appalachian forest loomed before him, an immense breathing entity of shadow and unknown dangers. The wind tore through the trees with a mournful howl, and each drop of rain that struck his face felt like a tiny, ice-cold stone. He could feel Hope's small body beginning to tremble in his arms, a violent, uncontrollable shivering that vibrated through his own exhausted frame. He was 11 years old, barefoot, and holding the only thing in the world that mattered, and the universe had just been reduced to this single, terrifying patch of mud outside a house that was no longer his. The paralysis was broken not by a thought, but by a feeling. It was the desperate, frantic shivering of his sister, a silent plea that cut through the fog of his shock. He looked down at her face, barely visible in the gloom, her eyes squeezed shut against the rain, her small mouth parted in a soft, sleeping whimper. In that instant, a fire ignited in his chest, a fierce, protective instinct that burned away the cold tendrils of despair. Terror was a luxury he could not afford. Grief was a weight he would have to carry later. His decision was not a product of logic or reason. It was a primal, undeniable command that rose from the very core of his being. He had to move. He had to find shelter. He had to keep her alive. This was no longer about surviving Delilah's cruelty. It was about surviving the world she had thrown them into. The past was gone, erased by a sliding piece of iron. The only thing that existed now was the next step, and the one after that. He forced himself to look away from the mocking darkness of the house and into the impenetrable blackness of the wilderness. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to reclaim him. The forest was not the friendly place of daytime walks with his father. It was a living nightmare, filled with the unseen rustling of predators and the disorienting shapes of ancient trees that seemed to claw at the storm-filled sky. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of a distant owl sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through him. He was a boy, not a woodsman. He was a brother, not a savior. The sheer impossibility of their situation threatened to crush him, to pin him to the spot until the cold seeped into their bones and finished the job Delilah had started. Doubt was a venom, and he could feel it trying to poison the resolve that had just begun to form in his heart. But a plan, however simple, began to form in the chaos of his mind. It was a plan born of pure necessity. First, they had to get away from the house, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the source of their betrayal. He couldn't risk Delilah changing her mind and coming after them for some other cruel purpose. Second, he needed to find some form of shelter, anything at all. An overhanging rock, a hollow log, a thicket of pines, anything that could offer a reprieve from the relentless, chilling rain. He had no food, no tools, and no fire. But if he could just get them out of the wind and the water, it would be a start. He remembered his father pointing out the ridges, explaining how water always flowed downhill. He would go up, away from the streams, hoping the higher ground might offer a clearer path or a better vantage point, should the sun ever rise again. He needed a source of strength beyond his own dwindling reserves, and his mind latched onto the memory of his father's hands. He pictured them clearly, large, calloused, and infinitely capable, stained with wood varnish and dusted with fine sawdust. He remembered the feeling of those hands guiding his own as he learned to hold a hammer, the gentle but firm pressure that communicated safety and competence. His father had been a builder, a man who created order and warmth from the raw chaos of the wilderness. He had built their home, their furniture, their lives. Levi knew he could not build a shelter with his bare hands, But he could build a path forward with his feet. He could take that same spirit of creation, that same stubborn refusal to be beaten by the elements, and use it to forge a trail through the darkness. His father was gone, but his legacy of resilience was a tool Levi could still wield. With a surge of borrowed strength, he made his final preparations. He shifted Hope's weight in his arms, trying to find a hold that was both secure for her and sustainable for him. He pulled the wet fabric of his own shirt away from his body and stretched it as far as it would go over her head and shoulders, a pitifully inadequate shield against the downpour, but it was all he had to offer. It was an act of profound sacrifice, exposing his own back to the full force of the wind so she might be spared a fraction of its bite. He pressed his lips to her cold forehead and whispered a silent promise into the storm, a vow that he would not fail her, that he would carry her until his legs gave out, and then he would crawl. This was his silent farewell to the boy he had been, and his solemn acceptance of the man he was now forced to become. The final impetus to move came from the forest itself. A sudden, violent gust of wind howled through the clearing, strong enough to make him stagger. It carried with it the sharp, cracking sound of a heavy branch breaking free and crashing to the forest floor somewhere nearby. The sound was a stark, brutal reminder that standing still was a form of surrender. The wilderness would not wait for him to gather his courage, it would simply consume them. The cold was already working its way deep into his muscles, and he knew that if he allowed it to take root, he would never find the strength to take that first step. The time for shock and fear was over. The time for action was now, or it would be never. He turned his back on the dark shape of the Thornton homestead, a place that held every good memory he had ever known, and now the very worst. He did not look back. He squared his shoulders, tightened his grip on his sister, and took a single deliberate step into the tree line. The mud squelched under his bare foot, cold and grasping, but he pulled it free and took another. He was walking away from the only life he had ever known and into a future that was a complete and terrifying unknown. He had no destination, no map, and no certainty of survival. All he had was the weight of his sister in his arms and a stubborn, desperate refusal to let her go. The journey into the heart of the Appalachian night had begun. The first step was an act of pure will, a severing from the world he knew. The cold mud of the Appalachian forest floor was a shocking, greedy thing, sucking at his bare feet, trying to hold him in place. It was a physical manifestation of the despair that threatened to swallow him whole. Each step was a battle against this grasping earth and the roaring chaos of the storm. The rain was not just water, it was a liquid cold that sought out every weak point, plastering his thin nightshirt to his skin and turning the air he breathed into a sharp, painful gasp. He held Hope tighter, her small, shivering body a fragile anchor in the maelstrom. The darkness was absolute, a solid wall of black that seemed to press in from all sides, and he walked into it blindly, his only guide the desperate, hammering rhythm of his own heart. He plunged into the tree line, and the forest immediately fought back. Thin, whip-like branches, invisible in the gloom, lashed out at his face and arms, leaving stinging red lines on his cold skin. Thorny vines snagged at his trousers, tearing at the thin fabric and his flesh beneath. The sound of the wind tearing through the canopy was a deafening, mournful howl, a sound so immense it seemed to be the voice of the wilderness itself, angry at their intrusion. He kept his head down, trying to shield his sister with his own body, absorbing the punishing assault. Every few feet, a root would snake out from the darkness, a hidden tripwire designed to send them sprawling. He learned to anticipate them, to move with a shuffling, cautious gait that was both exhausting and agonizingly slow, a testament to his fragile determination. The physical cost of this journey began to mount with terrifying speed. A sharp-edged stone, hidden beneath a layer of slick leaves, sliced open the sole of his left foot. The pain was a sudden white-hot flash, and he bit down hard on his lip to stifle a cry, the coppery taste of blood filling his mouth. He knew instinctively that any sound he made was a potential beacon for predators, both animal and human. He couldn't stop, couldn't even pause to inspect the wound. He simply adjusted his balance, putting more weight on his other foot, and kept moving. The pain became a constant throbbing companion to the burning ache that was spreading through his arms and shoulders, a fire of pure exhaustion from the unrelenting burden of carrying his sister through the unforgiving terrain. Total darkness became an enemy in itself, a relentless agent of confusion. Every direction was the same impenetrable black. The ancient trees, massive and gnarled, were monstrous shapes that offered no guidance, no sense of a path forward. A terrifying thought began to take root in his mind, that he was simply walking in circles, a lost soul tracing a path of futility around the very house he was trying to escape. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of his resolve. He fought it back by focusing on the ground beneath his feet, the feel of the slope. He remembered his father saying that high ground was safe ground, so he forced himself to walk upward, to climb, even when his burning muscles screamed in protest. It was a choice born not of knowledge but of a desperate, childlike faith in a dead man's wisdom. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. It was a sound sharp and distinct that did not belong to the storm, the definitive snap of a dry twig under a heavy foot, somewhere off to his right. It was too clean, too deliberate to be the wind. He stood motionless, his breath held tight in his chest, straining his ears against the roar of the rain. His mind conjured images of a hungry black bear or a lean, silent panther, their eyes glowing in the darkness. The silence that followed the sound was somehow more menacing, a void filled with the terrifying weight of the unknown. After a minute that stretched into an eternity, he forced his trembling legs to move again, this time with an almost unbearable slowness, each footfall placed with the desperate care of a man walking through a minefield. The storm, which had been a relentless punishment, now escalated its assault. The wind shifted, and the rain was no longer falling but driving, a horizontal barrage of ice-cold needles that found its way past any meager shelter he tried to create. It was a physical force, a great invisible hand pushing him, trying to knock him off his feet, to force him to the ground in surrender. He turned his back to the gale, hunching his shoulders and creating a small, inadequate cave of his own body around hope. He could feel the cold seeping through the drenched cotton of his shirt, a deep, invasive chill that settled not just in his skin, but in his very bones. He was a living shield, and he could feel himself slowly being eroded by the elements, worn down piece by piece. He nearly stumbled over it in the darkness, the immense sprawling root of a great oak tree. Following it upward, he found the trunk, a solid, unmoving pillar in the chaos. He slid down its rough bark, slumping into the small space protected by the overhang of its ancient roots. Here, for a few precious moments, the direct assault of the wind and rain was blunted. He gasped for air, his lungs burning, his legs shaking so violently he could barely remain upright. He looked down at Hope's face, a pale smudge in the deep gloom. Her shivering had subsided, a change that brought him no comfort. He touched her forehead with his lips and felt the dry, dangerous heat of a rising fever. The temporary safety of the tree was a cruel illusion. A new, internal storm was gathering in his sister's small body. The exhaustion was no longer just a feeling. It was a presence, a heavy shadow that clung to him, whispering of the sweet relief of surrender. His eyelids felt like lead weights, and the relentless noise of the storm was becoming a hypnotic, dull roar. The urge to simply lie down in the mud, to curl up and let the darkness take them, was a powerful, seductive poison. He fought it with the only weapon he had left, memory. He began to whisper the words of a prayer his mother had taught him, a simple plea for guidance and protection. The words were almost meaningless now, a rhythmic chant against the storm. But the act of speaking them, of forcing his mind to form the syllables, was an anchor. It was a thread connecting him to a time of warmth and safety, a fragile lifeline in an ocean of cold despair. He heard it before he saw it, a low, hungry, churning sound that grew louder as he pushed through a thicket of rhododendron. The ground fell away sharply, and he found himself on the bank of a creek, swollen by the relentless downpour into a fast-moving black torrent. In the darkness, it looked like a river, an impassable barrier. He could see the faint glint of moonlight on the churning water, revealing its speed and power. Turning back was not an option. Delilah's house was behind him. Following the bank could lead him anywhere or nowhere. A cold, hard certainty settled in his stomach. There was no way around. The only path forward was through the water. He took a deep breath, the cold air searing his lungs, and prepared for the plunge into the icy blackness. The first step into the creek was a shock so profound it nearly stopped his heart. The cold was absolute, a physical blow that stole his breath and sent a violent tremor through his entire body. It was a living thing, this water, a predator that latched onto his legs and tried to drag all the warmth from him. The current was deceptively strong, pulling and tugging at him, forcing him to brace with every step. He held Hope high on his chest, his arms screaming in protest at the added strain. The rocks on the creek bed were slick and treacherous, shifting under his bruised and bleeding feet. He was halfway across, the water surging around his waist, when his foot slipped on a moss-covered stone. For one terrifying, heart-stopping moment, he was falling. His world tilted sideways, the roar of the water filling his ears as the current grabbed him, pulling him down. A desperate, primal instinct took over. He twisted his body, throwing his weight against the pull of the water, his free hand plunging into the icy torrent, searching for anything to hold on to. His fingers closed around a submerged rock, the sharp edges digging into his palm, but the grip held. With a surge of pure adrenaline, he righted himself, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had almost lost them. He had almost failed. The near disaster gave him a new, frantic strength. He scrambled the rest of the way, driven by pure terror. He hauled himself onto the opposite bank, collapsing onto the cold, wet earth, his body a dead weight. He was completely numb, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. He lay there in the mud, his chest heaving, sucking in ragged gulps of air. The crossing had stripped him of what little energy he had left. He could feel Hope's small body, limp in his arms, her breathing shallow. The fever was no longer just a fear. It was a reality, a fire he had no way of fighting. He had made it across the water, but to what? The forest on this side was just as dark, just as menacing. A wave of profound hopelessness washed over him, so powerful it was almost a physical blow. He had given everything, and it felt like he had gained nothing at all. He was on the verge of giving up, of letting the cold and the exhaustion finally claim them, when he saw it. Through a small break in the dense canopy above, the sky was no longer a uniform, impenetrable black. To the east it had softened to a deep bruised purple, the first faint hint of a coming dawn. It was not warmth. It was not safety. But it was a promise that the endless, terrifying night was finally beginning to release its grip on the world. It was the smallest flicker of hope, but it was enough. With a groan that seemed to tear from the depths of his soul, Levi pushed himself onto his hands and knees. He got one foot under him, then the other, and hoisting his sister's feverish body back into his arms, he continued to walk. The world had been reduced to a blur of green and grey, a punishing landscape of rain-soaked leaves and slick, dark stone. Levi's entire existence was focused on the next agonizing step, on keeping his balance, on ignoring the fire in his arms and the ice in his bones. Then, as he crested a small moss-covered ridge, the forest simply ended. Before him lay a small, circular clearing, and in its center a vision so impossible it had to be a fever dream. It was a small white wooden chapel, its paint clean and bright against the oppressive gloom of the wilderness. A simple, unadorned cross sat atop its pitched roof, a stark silhouette against the bruised purple of the dawn sky. There was no road, no path, not even a faint trail leading to its door. It simply stood there, an island of serene order in an ocean of untamed chaos, a silent, unbelievable testament to a faith he thought the world had forgotten. For a long moment, he could only stare, his exhausted mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing, certain that it was a cruel mirage that would dissolve with the next gust of wind. The 100 yards that separated him from the chapel felt more arduous than the entire night's journey combined. Each step was a negotiation with his own failing body. His legs, trembling and weak, threatened to buckle with every shift in the uneven ground. His arms, which had been numb with a deep aching exhaustion, now burned with a new, sharp pain as he readjusted his grip on Hope, her feverish body a constant searing reminder of their dwindling time. The chapel did not vanish. It grew more solid, more real, with each torturous footfall. He could see the individual planks of wood, the simple glass in the 2 arched windows, the dark, solid wood of the front door. He fixed his gaze upon that door, making it his only goal, the single point in the universe that mattered. He was no longer walking through a forest. He was making a pilgrimage across the last, most difficult stretch of a desolate and godless land, driven forward only by the faint, flickering promise of sanctuary. He finally reached the small porch, his bare feet registering the shocking flatness and stability of the wooden planks beneath them. He stood before the door for a full second, his breath catching in his throat, a fresh wave of despair washing over him. It would be locked. Of course it would be locked. It was the final, logical cruelty in a night defined by it. It was a beautiful, empty promise, a shelter he could see but never enter. Still, he had to try. He shifted Hope's weight to one hip, freeing a hand that shook so badly he could barely control it. He reached out, his trembling fingers making contact with the cold, smooth iron of the latch. He pressed down, expecting the unmoving resistance of a bolt. Instead, the latch gave way with a soft, metallic click. The door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, opening into a space of deep, welcoming darkness, an invitation out of the storm. The moment he crossed the threshold, the world changed. The relentless, howling wind was instantly silenced, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like a physical presence. The biting, wet cold of the October morning was cut off as if by a knife, and the air inside was dry, cool and thick, with the clean, reverent scent of aged pine and old beeswax. It was the smell of peace, the smell of safety, a fragrance that spoke of quiet contemplation and years of undisturbed solitude. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the sacred air filling his lungs, and for the first time in 8 hours, the frantic, panicked tension in his shoulders began to dissolve. He stood just inside the doorway, letting the profound silence wash over him, a balm on the raw, open wounds of his terror. This place was not just a building, it was a reprieve, a fortress against the savagery of the world he had just escaped. As his eyes slowly adjusted to the dim, serene light filtering through the chapel's windows, the interior revealed itself. It was a place of profound and humble simplicity. A single narrow aisle ran between 2 sets of short, backless pews, all carved from the same dark, rich wood as the walls. At the far end of the room stood a small plain altar, with nothing upon it but a single unlit candle in a simple brass holder. There were no ornate decorations, no stained glass, no gilded icons. Everything was functional, clean, and meticulously cared for. It was a space built not for show, but for purpose. He could feel a sense of history in the still air, the faint, lingering presence of every soul who had ever sought solace within these walls. It was a place hollowed out by prayer, and in that moment, Levi felt a sense of awe that momentarily eclipsed his own exhaustion and pain. His first and only thought was for Hope. His gaze swept the room, searching for the safest, warmest place to lay her down. He saw a corner near the front, away from the door and any potential drafts. He moved with a slow, deliberate shuffle, his bare feet making soft, scuffing sounds on the clean-swept floorboards. The solid wood felt impossibly sturdy beneath him, an anchor after the treacherous, yielding mud of the forest. He knelt, his knees protesting with a sharp, grinding pain, and gently, so very gently, laid his sister down upon the floor. He unwrapped his own soaked, tattered shirt from around her shoulders and arranged it as a makeshift pillow beneath her head. The relief of her weight finally leaving his arms was an explosive, dizzying sensation. It was so sudden and so absolute that the world tilted violently, and he had to place a hand on the floor to keep from collapsing beside her. It was only then, as he knelt there catching his breath, that his eyes truly focused on the corner he had chosen. It was not empty. Stacked against the wall with perfect geometric precision was a pile of thick, dark woolen blankets. They were clean, folded, and waiting. His mind, slow and fogged with exhaustion, struggled to process the sight. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the top one. The wool was coarse and heavy, and most importantly, it was completely dry. It was an impossible, miraculous provision. He pulled one free from the stack and carefully, tenderly, draped it over Hope's small, feverish body, tucking it in around her sides. The simple act of providing her with this small comfort, this basic human warmth, felt like the most significant thing he had ever done in his entire life. He was not just a protector, he was now a provider. His gaze lifted from the blankets and fell upon a small, rough-hewn shelf mounted on the wall just above them. What he saw there made his breath catch in his chest. There were 3 large glass jars filled with a dark amber liquid that could only be honey, their wax seals unbroken. Next to them were several cloth sacks neatly tied that he knew must contain oats or flour. And beside those, a small wooden box containing a half-dozen white candles and a small precious block of friction matches. This was not an accident. This was not a forgotten storage space. This was a deliberate, methodical, and compassionate act of preparation. Someone, at some point in the past, had looked at this empty wilderness and thought of a person exactly like him, lost, cold, and hungry. Someone had anticipated his desperation and left behind the tools for survival. The final discovery was the one that shattered his composure completely. To the right of the shelf stood a small black cast-iron stove, its surface free of rust, its small door slightly ajar. And next to it, stacked with the care of a master woodsman, was a generous pile of dry split firewood and a small bundle of kindling. This was the detail that broke through the fog of his exhaustion and struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was not just food, it was not just blankets, it was the means to create heat, to fight back the killing cold, to make the porridge that would bring his sister back from the edge. This wasn't just charity, it was a profound act of empathy. It was a message sent across time from an unknown benefactor, a message that said, "You are not alone. You are seen. You deserve to live." He stood frozen for a long moment, his gaze shifting from the impossible pile of wood to Hope's pale face, her breathing still shallow and fast. The entire weight of the last 8 hours, the terror of the forest, the pain of his cut feet, the soul-crushing despair of their abandonment, all of it came rushing back. But it was immediately eclipsed by a new, far more powerful emotion. It was a sense of gratitude so immense, so overwhelming, that it felt like it would tear him apart. In a world that had systematically stripped him of everything, that had cast him out to die, he had stumbled into a pocket of inexplicable grace. This small, silent chapel was not just a shelter from the storm, it was a shelter from the fundamental cruelty of the world. It was proof that goodness existed, even if it was hidden, silent, and waiting in a place you could never expect to find it. With movements that felt both clumsy and sacred, he knelt before the stove. His hands were shaking so violently that it took him 3 tries to strike a match. The small flare of sulfur and the first tentative catch of the kindling was the most beautiful sight he had ever witnessed. He fed the small flame, watching it grow, watching it consume the dry wood and begin to radiate a gentle, life-giving warmth. The first wave of heat washed over him, pushing back the deep-settled chill in his bones. He looked over at his sister, the soft, flickering firelight dancing across her sleeping face, and the dam of his resolve, finally, completely, broke. He fell to his knees on the rough-hewn floorboards before the simple altar, and a sound he had suppressed all night tore from his throat. He wept, not from pain or fear, but from a profound and overwhelming thankfulness so immense it felt like it would shatter his very bones. For 2 full weeks, the small chapel became their entire universe, a self-contained world of warmth and healing. Levi's days fell into a simple, sacred rhythm dictated entirely by his sister's needs. He kept the fire in the small stove burning constantly, a vigilant guardian against the lingering chill of the Appalachian autumn. He learned to make a thin, sweet porridge from the dried oats and honey, feeding it to Hope in small, careful spoonfuls, watching for the slightest sign of returning strength. He would sit by her side for hours, his hand resting on her forehead, feeling the raging fever slowly, almost imperceptibly, recede. In the profound silence of the chapel, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of his sister's soft breathing, Levi felt a sense of purpose that was both terrifying and deeply grounding. He was no longer a victim fleeing a monster. He was a caretaker, a protector, a brother fighting a quiet, desperate war against the sickness that had claimed his father. During this time of quiet vigil, his gratitude for the chapel and its mysterious provisions deepened into a form of reverence. Every object seemed imbued with a sacred significance. The woolen blankets were not just cloth. They were a shield against the cold that had nearly killed them. The jars of honey were not just food, they were medicine, a sweet golden antidote to the bitterness of their abandonment. The dry firewood was not just fuel, it was the very source of life, the engine of their survival. He found himself handling these simple items with a gentle, careful touch, as if they were holy relics. He could not comprehend the source of this impossible generosity, and so in his mind it became a pure and simple miracle, a direct intervention from a God he had all but given up on. He believed they had stumbled upon a forgotten corner of heaven, a place left behind by angels for reasons he would never understand. The discovery that changed everything came on the fourth day, during a rare moment when hope was sleeping peacefully and the fire was burning steadily. Levi allowed himself to explore the small space more thoroughly, his bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. His eyes traced the clean lines of the walls, the simple craftsmanship of the pews, the stark beauty of the unadorned altar. It was then that he saw it, hanging on the wall to the right of the door, a small, hand-carved wooden plaque that he had somehow overlooked in his exhaustion and frantic activity. It was no larger than a book, the letters burned carefully into the pale wood. He stepped closer, his heart beginning to beat a little faster, a sense of premonition washing over him. He knew, with an instinct he couldn't explain, that this small piece of wood held the answer to the question that had been echoing in the back of his mind. Why? He stood before the plaque, his fingers tracing the edges of the carved letters, his lips forming the words as he read them aloud in a hushed whisper. Chapel of the Good Shepherd, built 1871 by the missionary brothers of St. Francis. The first line gave the place a name, a history, grounding it in the real world. But it was the second line that struck him with the force of a physical blow, a revelation so profound it made his knees feel weak. For any lost traveler in need of shelter, this house is yours. God sees the forgotten. He read the words again and then a third time, letting their meaning sink into the deepest parts of his soul. It was not a miracle in the way he had imagined. It was not the work of angels or divine apparitions. It was something far more tangible and, in its own way, far more powerful. It was the work of men. This was not an accident. It was a plan. It was a deliberate, premeditated act of compassion. A group of men he had never met, whose faces he would never see, had stood in this exact spot more than a decade earlier and had thought of him. They had looked out at the vast, unforgiving wilderness and had imagined a child lost and freezing, a family fleeing some unknown disaster, a soul on the verge of giving up. They had not only imagined it, they had acted on it. They had carried the wood, hammered the nails, and raised this structure not for their own glory or for a congregation, but for a person they would never know, a person whose only credential was that they were lost and in need of help. The realization was a quiet explosion in his mind, completely reordering his understanding of the world. He thought of Delilah, her face a cold mask of indifference as she pointed them toward the darkness. Her cruelty had been personal, specific, and calculated. She had seen them, known them, and had actively chosen to discard them like trash. The kindness of the missionary brothers was the perfect mirror opposite. It was anonymous, general, and deeply intentional. They had not seen his face, did not know his name, but they had seen his humanity. They had looked into the future and had left behind a lifeline, a testament of faith not just in God, but in the simple, enduring fact that a stranger's life had value. The contrast was so stark, so absolute, that it brought tears to his eyes. He had been so focused on the one person who had abandoned him that he had failed to see the countless invisible hands that were there to catch him. He walked back over to the small stove, a new sense of wonder filling him. He ran his hand over the cast iron, no longer seeing just a stove, but a piece of a promise. He looked at the neatly stacked firewood and pictured the hands that had cut it, the arms that had carried it, the forethought that had placed it there, knowing that one day it would be the difference between life and death for someone. He picked up a jar of honey, its weight solid and real in his hands, and understood that this was not just food. It was a message that said, "We see you, we care. "You are not forgotten." The words on the plaque echoed in his mind. God sees the forgotten. But Levi now understood a deeper truth. Sometimes God sees the forgotten through the eyes of other people. This was a different kind of faith than the one his mother had taught him through whispered prayers. That faith had been about pleading with an unseen power for mercy. This faith was about witnessing the tangible evidence of mercy already at work in the world. It was a faith built not on hope for a future intervention, but on the overwhelming proof of a past sacrifice. These brothers, whoever they were, had given their time, their labor, and their resources to build this sanctuary. They had asked for nothing in return. Their reward was the quiet, anonymous knowledge that a place of safety existed in a world of danger. It was the purest form of love he had ever encountered, a love that expected no acknowledgement and offered no judgment. He went to the window and looked out at the dense, intimidating forest that had nearly claimed them. It no longer looked like an enemy. It was just a place, a wilderness, and within it, someone had planted this seed of hope. The world was not divided into good and evil, he realized, but into those who build and those who destroy. Delilah had tried to destroy them, to erase their existence. The brothers had built a place to preserve existence. In that small chapel, surrounded by the evidence of their compassion, Levi felt a profound shift inside him. The deep, bitter wound of his stepmother's betrayal was still there, but it was no longer the only thing he could feel. It was now surrounded by the warm, healing balm of a stranger's inexplicable kindness. He walked back to his sister's side and knelt down. Hope was stirring, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at him, and for the first time in days, her eyes were clear. The fever had broken. A small, weak smile touched her lips. "Levi," she whispered, her voice raspy. He took her small hand in his, a fresh wave of tears blurring his vision. He was not crying from gratitude for a miracle anymore. He was crying from a place of deep human connection to the men who had built that chapel. He was crying because he finally understood that even when you are thrown away, even when you are locked out and left to die in the darkness, you are never truly alone. Someone somewhere has already thought of you. On the 15th day, the profound silence of their sanctuary was broken by a sound that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Levi's body. The distinct crunch of footsteps on the leaves outside, followed by the soft creak of the porch steps. He moved instantly, his heart pounding against his ribs. He grabbed the small kitchen knife from the shelf, his only weapon, and placed himself between the door and his sister, who was now strong enough to be sitting up, wrapped in a blanket. He was no longer the terrified boy who had fled into the storm. He was the fierce guardian of this sacred space, ready to defend it with his life. The door latch clicked, and the door swung open, revealing not a threat but an old man with a kind, wrinkled face and a worn black coat, his white hair thin in the autumn breeze. The man's eyes widened, first in shock, and then with a look of profound, tearful wonder. This was Reverend Ezekiel Hartley, an itinerant preacher who made a solitary pilgrimage to this remote chapel twice a year to replenish its supplies and offer a prayer. In the 12 years since its construction, he had never once found a soul inside. He had begun to think of it as a failed experiment in faith, a monument to a hope that had never been realized. Finding Levi and Hope, alive and safe, was for him the answer to a lifetime of quiet, unanswered prayers for a family of his own. After hearing Levi's harrowing story, the old preacher wept, not with pity, but with a righteous fury and an overwhelming sense of purpose. He wrapped the children in his arms, and for the first time since his father's death, Levi allowed himself to feel the safety of a protector's embrace. Their time in the wilderness was over. The arrival of the Reverend set in motion a chain of events that brought a swift and terrible justice. An investigation was launched into Delilah Crane, and her carefully constructed life began to unravel. The story of the 2 abandoned children was shocking enough, but it led authorities to look into her past, uncovering a darker history. It was discovered that 2 stepchildren from a previous marriage had also vanished under mysterious circumstances. A search of her former property unearthed their small bodies, buried in a shallow grave behind a smokehouse. Delilah was tried for murder, her cold indifference on the stand sealing her fate. She was hanged before the first snows of winter fell, a dark chapter in the county's history, brought to a decisive and somber close. For Levi and Hope, the future began not with vengeance, but with the quiet, steady work of building a new life. Reverend Hartley, a man whose heart was as large as the wilderness he traveled, formally adopted them. They moved into his small, book-filled home in the nearby town, a place of warmth, stability, and unconditional love. The scars of their ordeal remained, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They were reminders of what they had survived, testaments to the resilience of the human spirit and the unexpected grace they had found in a lonely chapel. Levi learned to read and write, devouring the Reverend's books, his mind ignited by the stories of faith and service, seeing in them a reflection of the anonymous brothers who had saved his life. Inspired by his own salvation, Levi followed in the Reverend's footsteps, becoming a pastor himself at the age of 25. But his calling was unique. He dedicated his life not to a single church, but to the wild, forgotten places of the world. He used his inheritance from his father, which had been recovered after Delilah's conviction, to build and maintain a network of remote shelters throughout the Appalachian Mountains, each one modeled after the Chapel of the Good Shepherd, each one stocked with blankets, food, and firewood. He became a quiet, unseen guardian for the lost, continuing the sacred work of the missionary brothers. Hope, driven by the memory of her own brush with death, became a missionary nurse, often traveling with her brother, her skills a beacon of healing in the darkest and most remote corners of the mountains. Years later, when people would ask Levi how he had found the strength to survive that terrible night, how a barefooted boy carrying his sister had managed to walk through a storm that should have killed them, he would always give the same answer. He would look off toward the distant, blue-hued mountains, his eyes filled with a quiet, knowing light. He would say that he didn't believe in passive miracles, in a God who simply swooped down to save the helpless. He believed in a God who lit a path. Providence, he would say, only works for those who keep walking, especially when they cannot see the way forward. You had to take the step. You had to brave the darkness. You had to believe, against all evidence to the contrary, that somewhere in the wilderness ahead, a light had been left on for you.